You might have seen videos of tourists in China freaking out like this.
This is just crazy. The design, the architecture.
They're just way ahead of the world. The fastest trains, everything's modern.
Yeah, New York, looking kinda rough. It's crazy to think that just 30 years ago, China was really poor. Now, its cities feel decades ahead. High-speed rail, full 5G coverage, even drone deliveries. You might think, oh, China just builds really fast, but the real reason is way deeper than that. So let's get into it right now. Alright, first things first, how did China's cities get so big so fast? In 1978, only 18% of China's population live in cities. Today, the number is over 65% and still climbing. That means that since then, over 600 million people moved from the countryside into cities, the largest urban migration in history. That's almost 2 Americas worth of people. And here's the thing, this massive urbanization didn't just happen on its own. China's government made it happen. In the 80s and 90s, China's economy was just starting to open up. Foreign investment was pouring in. The whole made in China boom was just beginning. And China needed workers in the cities. A lot of them. Not just for factories, but for building the roads, bridges, and entire districts for supporting these new industries. In order to push people into these cities, the government loosened restrictions on a policy called the hukou system. The hukou was a household registration system that kept people tied to their birthplace, restricting their ability to move. But as cities boomed, the government relaxed hukou rules. This made it easier for millions of rural workers to move for work. And remember, these people were dirt poor. To them, a factory or construction job was a chance at a better life. So, they moved by the millions every single year. But here's the problem. Cities back then weren't ready for this kind of population explosion. So China didn't just expand its cities, it rebuilt them. Skyscrapers and high-rise apartments replaced older, low-rise buildings because going vertical was the only way to house so many new workers. Subway systems expanded at record speed to help workers travel around more easily. Highways, bridges, and bullet trains connected entire regions so that people and goods could move faster than ever. And in some cases, they didn't just expand old cities, they built entirely new ones, like Shenzhen. 40 years ago, Shenzhen wasn't even a real city. It was just a cluster of fishing villages and rice paddies sitting across the water from Hong Kong. But today, Shenzhen is a global tech capital, home to 17 million people and the largest tech companies in China. Urbanization, driven by economic policy, created the need to build Shenzhen from nothing. And it also made it necessary to rebuild entire districts in older cities. Shanghai's Pudong district became a modern financial hub. Guangzhou turned into a manufacturing powerhouse with high-speed rail. But while urbanization explains the demand for modern infrastructure, it still doesn't explain how China built it all so fast. In most countries, big projects take forever. A new subway line might take 10 to 20 years. A highway expansion stuck in debates about zoning laws. A new business district maybe someday, if the funding ever comes through. But in China, entire cities are built at lightning speed. And the reason isn't just faster construction, it's political competition. Party officials like mayors don't just run their cities. They're competing with each other to make their city the biggest and fastest growing. Remember, China is a one-party state ruled by the Communist Party. So unlike in the West, Chinese city leaders aren't elected. They're promoted. And who decides if they move up? The central government in Beijing. For the last 3 decades, China's economy grew at a red-hot average of 10% a year, and Beijing wanted to keep the momentum going. So, the fastest way to climb the party ranks? Prove that your city was growing fast. That means that you had to have more economic growth, newer and bigger infrastructure projects, rapid urban expansion. That new industrial district attracts more businesses and boosts GDP. Another metro line? Sure, speeds up the local economy. The brand new shiny skyline makes your city look like the future. So party officials weren't just managing their cities, they were racing against other cities to see who could grow the fastest. And this turned urban development into a competition. Metro lines and highways get approved in months, not decades like in the West. Industrial zones pop up before companies even arrive. Entire business districts are built before there's even demand. This system turned local governments into city building machines. But here's the big question. Growth needs money. So where did all the money come from? And tax revenue alone wasn't nearly enough to fund all this massive expansion. Well, China's local officials actually found a way to fund this construction boom without waiting for tax dollars. The secret is they turn land into cash. In most countries, funding for infrastructure projects is slow and complicated. Projects often need years of approval and political debates. A lot of the times, they get delayed or cancelled. But in China, local governments don't wait for tax revenue or budgets. They sell land, or to be precise, the right to use the land, otherwise known as leasing. Unlike in most countries, Chinese cities don't really have property taxes. All land is technically owned by the state, but local governments fund infrastructure by leasing land to developers. Typically, these leases last between 40 to 70 years. Here's how it works. The city leases land to developers for a huge sum of money. Then, developers pay construction companies to build on it, whether there's highways, bridges, housing, or factories. The development then raises land values and the city sells more land at even higher prices. It's not just a one-time sale, it's a cycle that keeps feeding itself. This became the financial engine behind China's rapid modernization. High-speed rail, new business districts, massive subway networks, all funded with land sales. And because cities are competing to grow, officials are constantly selling off land to fuel expansion. Here's the part that makes China a beast at building infrastructure. It's not just fast, it's also cheap. Firstly, the land is cheap. Because local governments control land sales, they can offer the land at artificially low prices to encourage certain projects. Secondly, construction is cheap. China has state-owned construction giants that build at scale, keeping costs down. Thirdly, there's less red tape. No need for public consultations, environmental reviews, or legal battles. If the government wants to build something, it gets built. That's why China can build a high-speed rail line in 4 years, while California has been trying to build one since 2008, and it still isn't done. But land sales weren't the only source of funding. Many infrastructure projects weren't directly paid for by local governments. Instead, they were handed off to state-owned enterprises, otherwise known as SOEs. SOEs are government-backed companies that take on massive construction projects. Here's how it works. The government hands an SOE a project, a bridge, a railway, or toll road. The SOE then borrows money, often from government-owned banks, to build it. If the project makes money, great. If it loses money, the local government, which had made billions from the land sales, bails them out. Essentially, debt just gets shuffled around between local governments, SOEs, and the banks. This keeps projects moving fast. Of course, this system isn't perfect. Very frequently, relationships between developers and the local government officials can get too cozy, which often leads to corruption and other massive problems. We'll get into all this juicy stuff later, so stick around till the end. But first, why do China's big cities feel much more modern than the West? While cities in the US and Europe struggle to maintain aging infrastructure, China built its cities much later, often from scratch. That means, instead of fixing outdated roads and subways, China could design its cities for the future from the start. It built 46,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in just 15 years. Over 50 metro stations across China. Skylines that look straight out of a cyberpunk movie. But it wasn't just about starting later. Remember, China had to build cities that could handle the largest urban migration in history. Hundreds of millions of people were moving from rural areas to cities. That meant that local governments had no choice but to design the cities for efficiency. Wide planned road networks instead of chaotic expansions. Dense, high-rise living instead of sprawling suburbs like in the US. Smart infrastructure powered by AI, 5G, and automation. The result? Some of the most well-planned, high-density urban areas in the world. And here's why it worked. China invested way more money in their cities recently. especially when compared to the West. It spent on average between 7 to 10% of its GDP on infrastructure in the last 20 years. By comparison, the US spent just 2 to 3%. That's why China has been able to build world-class transit systems, high-speed rail, skyscrapers, and airports, while the West is still repairing bridges from the 1950s. A great comparison is the JFK Airport in New York versus Beijing's Daxing Airport. One was built in 1948 and is undergoing renovations now, while the other opened in 2019. One looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, while the other looks like it needs a GoFundMe. But of course, not every city in China looks super modern. Some cities like Shenzhen were planned from scratch, built to be modern, efficient, and high-tech, while others like the older parts of Beijing and Shanghai grew more organically over centuries, with historic districts and older infrastructure still in place. And a lot of these travel videos about China on YouTube, they mostly show the more modern and futuristic parts. The reality, it depends on when and how the city was developed. But one thing is true across almost every city in China: growth came first. Local governments prioritized construction at all costs. New buildings, roads, and transit systems had to go up fast. Funded by land sales and SOEs, cities were expanding non-stop. Construction wasn't just encouraged, it was a race. And when your entire system is built on rapid expansion, what happens when you build too much? You've probably seen videos of China's ghost cities. Entire districts with skyscrapers but no office workers, luxury apartments but no residents, massive malls but no customers. Why? Because local governments did not build them for demand, but for GDP growth. More construction means more GDP, which means more political promotions. More land sales equal more revenue for local governments. More development helps build the illusion of unstoppable progress. And this led to projects that barely made sense. A train station in the middle of farmland, waiting for a city to grow around it, and highways that led to nowhere. Take this story from the famous Chinese economist Jin Keyu, written in her book, The New China Playbook. A mayor in northeast China proudly led visitors to a massive bridge he had built. The problem? There was no river underneath it. When asked why, he just smiled and said, "Don't worry, the central government has agreed to dig a river later." This wasn't an isolated case. Across China, officials approved huge projects just to boost GDP numbers, whether they were actually needed or not. But this wasn't just wasteful spending. It was a warning sign. For years, real estate was the backbone of China's economy. Developers kept building, investors kept buying, prices kept rising, until too many apartments, not enough buyers, developers drowning in debt, local governments struggling as land sales slowed down. Then came Evergrande, one of China's biggest real estate giants, crushed under $300 billion in debt. Hundreds of projects left unfinished, millions of home buyers waiting for apartments they already paid for. For decades, China's economy was fueled by constant construction. But what happens when the building stops? This system built the most modern-looking cities in the world, which make Western cities look like relics. But can it keep going? Or has China's urban boom finally peaked? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. Maybe I'll cover that in another video. But if you want to learn about China before this era of urban explosion, I have the perfect video for you of China under the great Mao Zedong right here. Links in the description too. Peace.